What if your struggles today are the foundation of your success tomorrow? This is the story of Amaan, a student who battled self-doubt, failures, and pressure, but refused to give up. His journey will inspire you to keep going, no matter how tough the path seems. Because in the end, persistence always wins. Amaan sat at his small wooden desk, staring at the thick textbooks piled in front of him. His dimly lit room, cluttered with notes and papers, felt like a prison. His final exams were just a month away, but no matter how hard he tried, the words in the books refused to make sense. His mind drifted, clouded with doubt and frustration. He had never been the top student in his class. No matter how much effort he put in, his grades never seemed to match those of the brightest students. His teachers often reminded him to work harder, but he was starting to wonder, what was the point? Would his effort even make a difference? Amaan sighed and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He could hear the distant sounds of children playing outside, their laughter filling the evening air. He envied them. They were carefree, unaware of the pressure that weighed on students like him. His father's voice echoed from the living room. Amaan, stop wasting time and focus on your studies. These exams will decide your future. He had heard those words so many times that they had lost their meaning. Every teacher, every elder, every successful person repeated the same thing: study hard, and you will succeed. But what if success wasn't meant for him? What if no matter how hard he studied, he remained average? That night, Amaan sat at the dinner table with his mother, barely touching his food. His mother, noticing his unusual silence, gently placed a hand on his. "What's wrong, Beta?" she asked. Amaan hesitated before speaking. "Ammi. I don't think I'm smart enough. I try so hard, but my grades never improve. What if I fail?" His mother looked at him for a long moment, then smiled gently. "Do you know the story of the bamboo tree?" Amaan shook his head. She leaned in. "A farmer once planted a bamboo seed and watered it every day. For the first year, nothing happened. The second year passed, and still, no sign of growth. The third and fourth years came and went, and the seed remained buried in the soil. Most people would have given up, thinking the seed was useless. But the farmer was patient. Then, in the fifth year, something incredible happened. The bamboo tree suddenly grew 90 feet in just 6 weeks. Amaan listened, curious. How is that possible? His mother smiled. Because all those years, it was developing strong roots underground. The tree wasn't growing on the surface, but it was preparing itself for the future. The same thing happens with us. Just because you don't see immediate results doesn't mean you're not improving. Your hard work is never wasted. You're building your foundation. One day, everything will come together. Amaan sat quietly, absorbing her words. He had never thought about it that way. Maybe he was expecting results too soon. Maybe his struggles were part of a bigger journey. That night, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His mother's words echoed in his mind. The bamboo tree doesn't grow immediately, but when it does, it rises higher than anyone expects. Maybe he just needed to be patient with himself. The next morning, Amaan woke up with a different mindset. He decided to change the way he approached studying. Instead of thinking about how much he didn't know, he focused on improving little by little. The first thing he did was create a plan. He divided his subjects into smaller, manageable tasks. Instead of studying for long hours without focus, he set short, timed sessions. He took regular breaks and made sure to revise what he learned each day. The first few days were difficult. He still struggled with some subjects, and there were moments when frustration crept in. But each time he felt like giving up, he reminded himself of the bamboo tree. Growth takes time. One evening, he found himself stuck on a difficult math problem. No matter how many times he attempted it, he kept making mistakes. His frustration grew, and for a moment, he felt the familiar urge to give up. But then he remembered something else: successful students weren't those who never failed. They were the ones who learned from their mistakes. Instead of closing his book in defeat, Amaan took a deep breath and went over the problem again, step by step. He compared his solution to the textbook example, trying to find where he had gone wrong. After 30 minutes of careful work, he finally solved it. A sense of pride filled him. He had done it, not because he was naturally talented, but because he had refused to give up. Encouraged by this small victory, Amaan continued his new approach. He experimented with different study techniques, active recall, past paper practice, and even teaching concepts to his younger brother. Slowly, things started making more sense. One day in class, the teacher asked a difficult question. Normally, Amaan would have stayed silent, avoiding eye contact. But this time, he raised his hand. His classmates turned to look at him, surprised. "Yes, Amaan," the teacher said. Amaan took a deep breath and answered. His voice was steady, his explanation clear. The teacher smiled. "That's correct. Well done." Amaan felt a surge of confidence. For the first time in a long while, he believed that he was capable. Days turned into weeks, and although progress was slow, it was steady. His tests showed improvement. He was answering more confidently in class. But most importantly, he began believing in himself. One evening, as he sat on the rooftop, watching the sunset, he thought about how much he had changed in just a few weeks. He realized that success wasn't about being naturally gifted, it was about perseverance. It was about failing, learning, and trying again. For the first time in his life, he felt hopeful. The journey ahead was still long, but one thing was certain: he would never give up. Amaan woke up early, feeling determined. The past few weeks had been different. He was no longer the student who feared failure. Instead of dreading his books, he had started seeing them as tools that would shape his future. But despite his newfound motivation, the journey was far from easy. He sat at his study table, flipping through his math textbook. The numbers and formulas still seemed intimidating. He had improved, but there were days when his progress felt too slow. Some problems still took him hours to solve, and he sometimes found himself doubting his abilities again. What if I'm just not smart enough? What if all this effort is a waste of time? Shaking his head, he pushed those thoughts aside and picked up his pen. Giving up was no longer an option. That evening, he decided to change his approach. Instead of trying to do everything alone, he sought help. At school the next day, he walked up to Farhan, the class topper. Farhan was always confident, answering every question with ease. Amaan hesitated for a moment, then gathered his courage. "Farhan, can I ask you something?" Farhan looked up from his book and smiled. "Of course. What's up?" "I've been struggling with some math topics. You always seem to understand everything so well. How do you do it?" Farhan laughed. "Trust me, I wasn't always good at math. I struggled a lot in the beginning. But I changed the way I studied. Instead of just reading formulas, I started practicing every day. I treated mistakes as lessons instead of failures." Amaan listened carefully. "But what if I keep making the same mistakes?" Farhan nodded. "That's part of learning. Do you know how babies learn to walk? They fall hundreds of times, but they don't stop trying. Imagine if a baby gave up after falling a few times, they would never learn to walk. Studying is the same. Every mistake brings you one step closer to understanding." Amaan thought about this. He had always seen mistakes as proof of his weakness. But what if they were actually proof of his progress? "Can you help me with some questions?" he asked hesitantly. "Of course," Farhan said. "Let's go through them together." That day, Amaan experienced something new. Learning with someone who had already mastered the subject made things much easier. Farhan pointed out small errors in his calculations that Amaan hadn't even noticed before. Within an hour, Amaan understood concepts that had seemed impossible just days ago. From then on, Amaan made it a habit to study with his classmates. He joined a small study group where students discussed difficult topics together. He realized that asking questions wasn't a sign of weakness, it was a step toward improvement. But even with all this progress, challenges still came. One evening, Amaan was preparing for his science test when he heard his father calling him. "Amaan, come here." He walked into the living room and found his father holding his recent test paper. His heart sank. "Amaan, look at this." His father pointed to the red marks on the paper. "You studied so much, but you still lost marks. Why aren't you improving faster?" Amaan clenched his fists. He wanted to explain how much effort he was putting in, how much he had already improved. But he knew his father only cared about results. "I'll do better next time," he said quietly. His father sighed. "You need to work harder. If you don't get good marks, your future will be ruined." Amaan felt the familiar pressure creeping in. He returned to his room, feeling discouraged. Was all this effort pointless? Was he still too far behind? For the first time in weeks, he felt like quitting again. That night, he stared at his books but couldn't focus. He kept hearing his father's words, reminding him that he wasn't good enough. But then he remembered something his mother had told him: the bamboo tree doesn't grow in one day. But if you keep watering it, it will eventually rise higher than the rest. He took a deep breath. His father only saw the test paper, but Amaan knew how much he had improved. He wasn't failing anymore. He was learning. With renewed determination, he picked up his book and continued studying. A few days later, a difficult physics test arrived. Amaan felt nervous but reminded himself that he had prepared well. When the test started, he read through the questions carefully. Some were familiar, but others were tricky. There were moments when panic started creeping in, but he took deep breaths and focused on what he had learned. He remembered Farhan's advice: treat every mistake as a lesson. Instead of skipping the hard questions, he attempted them carefully. Even when he wasn't completely sure, he wrote down everything he knew. When the test ended, he felt unsure. Did I do well? Did I make mistakes? But he pushed those thoughts aside. He had given his best effort. A week later, the teacher announced the results. Amaan's heart pounded as he received his paper. He slowly looked down at the marks. His eyes widened. He had improved, significantly. It wasn't a perfect score, but it was higher than anything he had achieved before. For the first time, he felt a deep sense of pride. Not because he had scored well, but because he had proven to himself that hard work does pay off. Farhan patted his back. "See? I told you. Every bit of effort counts." Amaan smiled. He realized something important that day. Success wasn't about overnight results. It was about persistence, about showing up every day and doing your best, even when things seemed difficult. From that moment, Amaan stopped worrying about how far he had to go. He started focusing on how far he had already come. His journey wasn't over, but he knew one thing for sure: he would never give up. Amaan stood outside his school's notice board, his heart racing. Today was the day. The final exam results had been posted, and students crowded around the board, pushing and shoving to find their names on the list. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. His hands trembled as he scanned through the names. Row after row of marks appeared before his eyes, but he struggled to focus. Then, he saw it. Amaan Ahmed, 78%. His breath caught in his throat. He had done it. For a moment, he stood frozen. Just months ago, he had doubted himself. He had believed he was destined to be average. But now, he had proved himself wrong. A huge grin spread across his face as he turned away from the board. He wasn't at the top of the class, but he didn't care. What mattered was that he had improved, far more than he had ever thought possible. His classmates came rushing over. "Congratulations, Amaan," Farhan said, clapping him on the back. "You worked really hard for this," another friend added. Amaan could only nod, still processing what had happened. The journey had been tough. There had been nights of frustration, moments when he wanted to quit. But he had pushed through. Later that evening, when he returned home, he found his father sitting in the living room. Amaan hesitated for a moment before stepping forward and handing him the result sheet. His father glanced at it and then looked up. 78%, he asked. Amaan nodded, waiting for his father's reaction. There was a long silence. Then, to Amaan's surprise, his father smiled, a small but genuine smile. "You've improved," he said simply. Amaan felt a lump in his throat. This was the first time his father had acknowledged his progress. It wasn't a grand celebration, but for Amaan, it meant everything. His mother, who had been watching from the kitchen, came over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I knew you could do it." That night, Amaan sat on the rooftop, staring at the sky. The stars twinkled above him, and for the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. He realized something important. Success wasn't just about results. It was about the journey, the struggle, the lessons learned along the way. He thought back to the times he had almost given up, the moments of self-doubt, the long hours spent studying even when he didn't feel like it. Every step, every challenge, had led him here. As he looked ahead, he knew this was just the beginning. There were more goals to achieve, more obstacles to overcome. But now, he had something he never had before, confidence in himself. Amaan smiled. No matter what lay ahead, he knew one thing for sure: he would never give up.